Ever taken a flight and wondered what really goes on behind the curtain of first class? Some passengers aren't just traveling, they're making deals in the dark. When one flight attendant whispered for help, she had no idea the man she turned to was an undercover agent. But what happens when the hunter becomes the hunted, trapped at 30,000 feet with no way out? Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Darius Coleman adjusted the cuff of his navy blue blazer as he leaned back in the plush leather seat of the Skylink Airways VIP lounge. The hum of conversation, the clinking of expensive glassware, and the faint scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the space. Miami International Airport had always been a place of transition, people coming and going, business deals struck over overpriced whiskey, lives intersecting for brief moments before vanishing into different corners of the world. He wasn't here for leisure, though. His eyes flicked over the passengers around him, scanning for anything out of place. It was second nature after 20 years in law enforcement. But tonight, he wasn't just another traveler killing time before a flight. He was here with a purpose. Skylink Airways had come under quiet suspicion at the Bureau. There had been whispers, transactions, disappearances, names that surfaced in reports and then vanished just as quickly. Darius didn't know exactly what he was looking for yet, but his gut told him something was off, and his gut had rarely been wrong. The announcement for Flight 717 to New York crackled over the intercom. He rose, slung his carry-on over his shoulder, and made his way toward the gate. The moment he stepped into the first-class cabin, he felt it. That subtle shift in atmosphere, the way people held themselves differently. Money had a scent, a presence, and first class was saturated with it. Settling into seat 4D, he exhaled slowly, taking in the details. The woman across the aisle, a 40-something blonde with a diamond the size of a small island on her left hand, barely glanced at him before returning to her tablet. A few rows ahead, two men in tailored suits whispered in low voices, their heads bent together conspiratorially. Nothing out of the ordinary, yet. Then his eyes landed on her, Vivian Langley. She carried herself like she owned the place, because in many ways she did. Skylink Airways head flight attendant, a woman whose reputation preceded her. He had read her file, charismatic, efficient, and ruthlessly selective about the clientele she catered to. But beneath that polished exterior, there were rumors, connections to high-profile businessmen, transactions that didn't make it onto manifest. Vivian moved down the aisle with practiced ease, offering polite smiles, exchanging hushed words with passengers who clearly expected more than just a warm towel and a glass of champagne. When she reached Darius's row, something in her expression shifted, a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, but then just as quickly, it was gone. "Welcome aboard, sir," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I hope you enjoy your flight." Darius nodded, keeping his expression neutral. The plane's engines rumbled as the final passengers boarded, and within minutes, the doors sealed shut. As the cabin crew prepared for takeoff, Darius leaned back, letting the hum of the engines settle into his bones. He had been on countless flights before, but something about this one felt different, and he wasn't sure if that was a good thing. Darius didn't have to wait long for things to take a turn. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the first round of drinks was being served. Across the aisle, a man in a gray suit gestured for another whiskey, while a woman in pearl earrings scrolled idly through her phone. Everything appeared normal, if you didn't know what to look for. Then came the first red flag. A young flight attendant, no older than 25, approached the aisle with the kind of tension in her shoulders that didn't belong in first class. She carried a tray of champagne, her hands steady, but her eyes darted. Darius watched as she placed a glass in front of the man in 2A. A deliberate pause, a barely perceptible nod from him, and then, just like that, she moved on. It was nothing, and it was everything. Vivian Langley was back in the cabin, weaving between the rows like she was conducting an orchestra. She moved with the kind of confidence that came from knowing the game and controlling every piece on the board. When she reached Darius, she didn't just serve him, she assessed him, and then she smiled. "Quite the upgrade, isn't it?" Her voice was pleasant, but there was something underneath, something that crawled beneath the words. Darius raised a brow. Excuse me? She tilted her head slightly, pretending to adjust the napkin on his tray. I don't think I've seen you in first class before. Not quite the usual clientele. The meaning wasn't lost on him. Oh, I travel plenty, he said, matching her tone. Though I find it interesting how some people assume otherwise. Her lips curled slightly at the edges, as if she were toying with an inside joke only she understood. I'm sure. And just like that, she was gone. Darius exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the armrest. He had expected pushback, but he hadn't expected it so soon. The flight continued, but the unease settled in like an unwelcome passenger. He watched as Vivian made her rounds, always lingering just a second too long near certain individuals. He saw the discreet glances, the unspoken agreements. And then, there was the moment that changed everything. The young flight attendant, Nina according to her name tag, passed by again. This time she wasn't just nervous, she was scared. As she bent to clear a tray, she whispered so softly it was barely audible. Help me. Darius's jaw tensed, but before he could react, Vivian appeared behind her, resting a hand lightly on Nina's shoulder. The younger woman flinched. Vivian's smile was as polished as ever, but her eyes, cold. I think our new guest is quite comfortable, she said, her gaze never leaving his. A challenge, a warning. Darius knew the game had officially begun, and he had just become part of it. Darius let the moment settle, let the tension wrap around him like a second skin. He didn't react, didn't let his expression shift. He had played this game before, the quiet war of glances, of unspoken threats wrapped in pleasantries. Vivian Langley was testing him, watching for any sign of weakness, so he did what he did best. He waited. The flight carried on around him, passengers lost in their own little worlds, businessmen typing away on laptops, a woman leafing through a glossy magazine, the low hum of first-class luxury. But Darius wasn't focused on them. His eyes trailed Nina Alvarez as she continued working, her movements tense, measured. She had reached out to him, however briefly. That meant one of two things. She was either desperate or reckless, maybe both. Either way, she was running out of time. He glanced toward the galley where Vivian had disappeared, and something in his gut twisted. Nina was in danger, but before he could act, a shadow loomed over him. Enjoying your flight? Darius turned his head slowly, meeting the eyes of the man who had spoken. Jonathan Kane. He recognized the name instantly. A real estate mogul with a portfolio that stretched from New York to Dubai. Wealthy, influential, connected. But the reason Kane was on Darius's radar had nothing to do with skyscrapers. It was the whispers, the ones that tied his name to more than just business deals. Darius didn't blink. So far, so good. Kane gave a polite chuckle, sinking into the empty seat across from him, uninvited. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching it like it held secrets. You don't seem like the type who flies first class often. Darius leaned back, unfazed. And what type is that? Kane smiled, but it never reached his eyes. The kind who blends in. For the first time since stepping onto the plane, Darius felt it. The shift. This wasn't just about Vivian anymore. Kane had taken an interest, and that meant Darius had just become more than a curiosity. He was a problem. Kane set his drink down. Word of advice, sometimes it's best to enjoy the amenities and not ask too many questions. Darius met his gaze head on. I find that questions tend to lead to answers. Kane exhaled through his nose, amused. Then he leaned in just slightly. And answers can lead to problems. For a long beat, neither of them spoke. The background noise of the cabin faded, the tension crackling between them like static before a storm. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, Kane rose from his seat. He smoothed out his suit, lifted his glass, and offered a parting glance. Safe travels, Mr. Coleman. And with that, he walked away. Darius exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just about a corrupt flight crew anymore. Something much bigger was happening here. Darius had been on enough undercover assignments to know when a situation was spiraling faster than anticipated. This was one of those times. Kane's sudden interest in him was a problem, but it was Vivian he was more concerned about at the moment. She had disappeared into the galley with Nina nearly 10 minutes ago. Too long. He needed to move. With casual ease, he rose from his seat, stretching slightly as if he were just another passenger, working out a stiff back. He made his way down the aisle, slow, deliberate. When he reached the partition leading to the galley, he hesitated just long enough to check his surroundings. No one was paying attention, except one of the male flight attendants, standing near the curtain, arms crossed, watching. Darius adjusted course, stopping at the bar cart, where a row of wine glasses sat neatly arranged. He reached for one, turning it just slightly so the condensation on the glass revealed something underneath. A tiny marking etched at the base. SK, 2A. His pulse ticked up. It was the same marking he had seen on the napkin earlier. This wasn't random. It was a system, an encrypted way of identifying which passengers were part of whatever operation was running on this plane. Darius felt the presence behind him before he heard the voice. Something interesting? Vivian. Her tone was smooth as ever, but this time there was something else there. Something sharper. Darius turned, holding the glass between his fingers. Nice selection of wine. She studied him, head tilted slightly, her expression unreadable. Then, as if she had decided something, she reached past him and took the glass from his hand. Some things, she said, inspecting the marking at the base, are meant for the right people. She set it down carefully and met his gaze. I'd hate for someone to drink something they weren't supposed to. There it was, the warning. Darius didn't react. Good thing I'm more of a whiskey man. Vivian smiled, but the air between them had changed. The game was no longer subtle. She knew, and she wanted him to know that she knew. Darius nodded once, turning back toward his seat. As he walked, he took in his surroundings, memorizing details. The way the other flight attendants stole glances at him, the way Kane was watching from his seat, amused, and most of all, the way Nina never came back. This flight wasn't just transporting passengers. It was a transaction, and he had just become the wild card. Darius felt the weight of every step as he returned to his seat, his mind processing the situation at rapid speed. He had no backup, no weapon, and no clear way to contact the Bureau. Worse, he had just signaled to Vivian Langley that he wasn't some clueless traveler. That meant one thing. She would act soon. The hum of the cabin felt different now, more calculated. He could feel the eyes on him, Vivian's crew watching from the corners, Jonathan Kane's occasional glances from his seat. It was subtle, but to a man who had spent decades reading people, it was obvious. They weren't just waiting, they were deciding. He exhaled, adjusting his seatbelt just as a flight attendant passed. Not Nina, someone else. A man, tall, broad shoulders with a calm but alert posture. The kind of posture law enforcement had, or the kind of posture people had when they were trained to subdue someone. Darius's stomach tightened. Can I get you anything, sir? The attendant's voice was polite, but his tone was flat, measured. Darius shook his head. I'm good. The man lingered a second too long before nodding and walking away. Darius turned his head slightly, watching him move down the aisle. His instincts screamed. That wasn't just a flight attendant. That was a hired enforcer, and he was being watched for a reason. Darius shifted slightly, catching a glimpse of Vivian in the galley. She wasn't looking at him. She was speaking quietly to someone just out of sight. Her expression composed but firm. This was a test. They weren't sure about him yet, but they were close. Too close. He needed to take control before they made their move. The question was how. Darius knew he couldn't sit still, not with every second working against him. Nina was missing. That was his priority. If Vivian had moved her out of sight, there was a reason for it, and he wasn't about to wait until landing to find out why. He stood casually, stretching, as if he were just another passenger going for a walk. Moving toward the rear of the first-class cabin, he kept his expression neutral. The male flight attendant, the one who had questioned him earlier, was no longer in sight. That meant Vivian had repositioned her people. Smart, but not smart enough. As he reached the partition leading to the galley, he slowed, listening. Two voices. Vivian's was unmistakable, smooth and composed. The other was softer, hesitant. Nina. You don't understand. Nina's voice was barely above a whisper. I can't do this anymore. Vivian's response was a quiet laugh. You don't have a choice, sweetheart. Darius's jaw clenched. Then a sound. A short, sharp gasp, like someone being grabbed. Enough waiting. He moved. With one smooth motion, he pulled the curtain aside, stepping into the galley. The space was small, cramped with carts and supplies. Vivian was standing over Nina, her hand resting lightly on the younger woman's wrist. Not enough pressure to bruise, but enough to send a message. They both turned at the intrusion. Darius met Vivian's gaze. Am I interrupting something? Vivian's expression didn't falter. She smiled. Mr. Coleman, you really do have a habit of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Darius's eyes flicked to Nina. She looked pale, shaken, but she was alert. I was just having a private conversation with my employee, Vivian continued, still composed. You understand how important discretion is, don't you? Darius held her gaze, his mind working through the possibilities. He could push, demand answers, but he needed to be smart, so he went for something else. He smiled. Of course, but it looked more like a negotiation. Vivian's eyes darkened just slightly. What do you think you saw? Darius tilted his head. I think you are in the business of keeping certain people quiet, and I think I just walked into something you didn't want anyone to see. The air between them stretched, tension thick. Then Vivian let out a soft chuckle. You are interesting, Mr. Coleman. She released Nina's wrist, stepping back smoothly. Enjoy the rest of your flight. Darius didn't move. He glanced at Nina, giving her the slightest nod. A silent message. You're not alone. Nina hesitated, then barely perceptible she nodded back. Darius turned and walked away, knowing one thing for certain. Vivian Langley had just made a mistake, and now she knew it. Darius returned to his seat, his mind spinning through possibilities. Vivian had let him walk away too easily. That wasn't her style. No, this was a game to her. She knew he wasn't just another first-class passenger, and now she was watching him, testing him. He glanced across the cabin, scanning for the male flight attendant who had been watching him earlier. Gone. Jonathan Kane, however, was still there. The businessman sat comfortably in his seat, sipping his whiskey, but his eyes weren't on his drink. They were on Darius. A silent understanding passed between them. Kane wasn't just another passenger. He was part of this, and he was letting Darius know it. Darius looked away, keeping his expression unreadable. If they suspected he was more than a curious traveler, they would make a move soon. He needed to be ready before that happened. But first he needed to get a message out. He shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting his watch. The thin, nearly invisible wire embedded in the band was connected to a transmitter, a last resort tool for field agents. It wouldn't allow for full communication, but it could send a single pulse signal to a secure bureau line, alerting them that something was wrong. He pressed his thumb against the side, activating the sequence. One pulse, then another. Nothing. Darius's stomach tightened. The signal had been blocked. Vivian, or someone on this plane, had already cut off his ability to call for backup. This wasn't just about getting information anymore. This was about survival. The hum of the engines felt louder now, the walls of the cabin closing in. Darius sat still, forcing himself to breathe evenly, to think. He wasn't out of options yet, but time was no longer on his side. Vivian Langley had made her first move. Now it was his turn. A flicker of movement caught his attention. Nina. She was near the galley, avoiding eye contact, her posture tense. But then as she turned, she did something subtle, something only someone trained to read body language would notice. She glanced toward the emergency exit. Then she looked back at him. A signal. Darius felt a slow pulse of adrenaline. She was telling him something. But before he could act, Vivian's voice cut through the cabin, smooth and composed. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you're enjoying your flight. We'll be beginning our descent into New York shortly. Darius looked toward the galley again. Nina was gone. Vivian, however, was standing near the cockpit, her gaze locked onto him. And this time, she wasn't smiling. Darius understood the message. She knew. and she was about to end this flight on her terms. For the first time since boarding, Darius felt a chill crawl down his spine. The game was over. Now it was a fight. Darius's pulse remained steady, but he knew this was it. Vivian had made her move, and whatever came next wouldn't be subtle. The plane had begun its descent, and the flight attendants moved through the cabin with polite efficiency, securing trays and reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts. But beneath the routine, something else simmered. Vivian stood near the cockpit, her posture controlled, but her gaze never leaving him. Jonathan Kane was still in his seat, a picture of wealth and composure, but Darius could see it now. The slight tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers rested a little too carefully on the armrest. They weren't just preparing for landing. They were preparing for him. His first instinct was to get to Nina. She had signaled him for a reason. If she knew something, if she had a way out of this, he needed to get to her before it was too late. But he also knew Vivian wasn't stupid. If she was this confident, she had already accounted for that. So he waited. The moment came faster than expected. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, just enough to rattle the cabin. A few passengers murmured, some reaching for their drinks. And in that fraction of distraction, Darius saw it, Vivian subtly signaling to someone behind him. He turned just in time. The male flight attendant, the one who had been watching him all flight, was moving fast, reaching for something beneath his tray. Darius reacted before he could think. He twisted, knocking the tray upward. Silverware and glasses crashed to the floor. Gasps erupted around the cabin as the flight attendant stumbled back, his cover blown. But Darius wasn't done. He was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the man by the collar and shoving him back against the bulkhead. "Bad move," Darius murmured. The attendant struggled, but Darius leaned in, keeping his grip tight. "Where's Nina?" the man sneered. "Too late." Something in his voice sent a bolt of urgency through Darius. He had no time to waste. With a final shove, he released the man and moved toward the galley. Vivian hadn't moved. She simply watched, her arms crossed, her expression calm. "You're making a scene, Mr. Coleman," she said lightly. Darius ignored her, pushing past the curtain, and then he saw it. Nina, slumped against the wall, barely conscious. Darius's stomach dropped. He rushed forward, fingers pressing against her neck. A pulse, weak but there. She was drugged. "Smart, isn't it?" Vivian's voice came from behind him, smooth and unhurried. "No mess, no struggle. She'll wake up in a few hours and not remember a thing." Darius turned to face her, rage curling in his chest. "And by then what? She's disappeared?" Vivian smiled. "That depends on you." The unspoken threat hung between them. Darius clenched his fists. He had to think. He had to move. But the plane was landing, and time had just run out. The wheels touched down with a jolt. Darius barely noticed. His focus was on Nina, on the slow rise and fall of her chest. She was alive, but she wasn't safe. Not yet. Vivian stood just outside the galley, her expression one of amusement, as if this were nothing more than a game she had already won. And maybe in her mind, she had. Darius knew better. The moment the seatbelt sign flicked off, passengers began standing, reaching for their belongings. The usual chaos of disembarking filled the cabin, a perfect cover for whatever was about to happen next. Vivian didn't move. Neither did Kane. But the male flight attendant, the one Darius had confronted, was gone. That was the problem with predators. They didn't attack in the open. They waited for the right moment. Darius moved fast. He grabbed Nina under the arms, hoisting her into a sitting position. "Nina," he murmured, tapping her cheek. "Come on, wake up." A soft groan. "Good." He turned, eyes locking on Vivian. "You're not walking off this plane," she smirked. "That's where you're wrong." And then chaos. Kane rose from his seat. The flight attendant reappeared at the cabin door. And Vivian? She just smiled, because she knew something Darius didn't. Something was waiting for him outside this plane. And whatever it was, he wasn't supposed to survive it. The air inside the cabin was thick with tension, but the real danger waited outside. Darius kept his grip firm on Nina as she struggled to fully regain consciousness. The drug was wearing off, but not fast enough. He didn't have time. The first-class passengers were gathering their belongings, oblivious to the undercurrent of danger humming beneath the surface. Some of them, Darius knew, weren't just innocent travelers. Kane had made it clear. This flight wasn't just a means of transportation. It was a marketplace, and the transaction was about to be completed. Vivian stood near the exit, composed as ever, her arms crossed. She wasn't worried, not about being stopped, not about Darius, because she believed she had already won. He needed to change that. The line of passengers began moving forward, filtering toward the open cabin door. Beyond it, the jet bridge stretched into the terminal. Normal, expected, except Darius knew better. Vivian wouldn't take a chance on airport security handling this for her. She had someone waiting, someone who would make sure he never left this airport alive. Kane was the first to disembark, his movements unhurried. As he passed Darius, he glanced down at Nina, and then up at him, smirking. "Enjoy New York," he murmured. Darius's muscles coiled. If he acted now, in the middle of the plane, he wouldn't make it 2 feet before someone put a bullet in his back. So he forced himself to wait. Vivian lingered as the last of the passengers trickled out, then turned to face him. "You should really consider staying out of things that don't concern you." Darius gave her a slow smile. "See, that's the thing. You made it my concern." Vivian chuckled, shaking her head as she stepped into the jet bridge. "Your mistake." Darius didn't wait any longer. He hoisted Nina onto her feet, supporting most of her weight, and moved. As soon as he stepped off the plane, he saw them. 2 men dressed like airport security, standing just past the checkpoint. Their stance was too rigid, their eyes too focused. Not TSA, hired guns. And they were waiting for him. The corridor leading to Gate 2A was deceptively quiet. Too quiet. Darius's instincts screamed. This wasn't just an ambush. It was a carefully planned execution. Vivian was already a few steps ahead, walking at a steady, confident pace. She wasn't in a rush because she didn't have to be. Her men were in place. All she had to do was step aside and let them clean up the problem. Him. Darius kept moving, supporting Nina as she tried to blink the fog from her vision. "I don't feel so." "I know," he murmured, keeping his voice low. "But I need you to listen to me. Can you stand on your own?" Nina swallowed hard, nodding weakly. Darius slowed slightly, angling his body just enough to take stock of his surroundings. The 2 men in security uniforms had moved subtly, adjusting their stance, preparing. A few real airport employees lingered near the baggage claim area, unaware of what was about to happen. If he wanted to survive, he had to make a move before they did. His fingers grazed the edge of his belt. He had nothing but instinct and training. No gun, no backup. But he did have the advantage of knowing exactly when they would strike. Vivian reached the checkpoint, paused, and turned just slightly, her head tilted in amusement. That was the signal. The first man reached into his jacket. Darius exploded into motion. He shoved Nina to the side, sending her stumbling into a luggage cart just as the man pulled his weapon. A silencer. Smart. Darius didn't wait to see the gun rise. He was already moving. He slammed into the shooter, forcing the man's arm up as the muffled shot discharged into the ceiling. Gasps rang out. A woman screamed. Chaos erupted. Vivian cursed, stepping back. This wasn't the clean takedown she had planned. Darius grabbed the shooter's wrist, twisting hard. The gun clattered to the floor. He didn't have time to reach for it. The second man was already drawing his weapon. A blur of movement. Nina. Still groggy, barely standing, but aware enough to do the one thing that mattered. She threw herself at the second shooter. It wasn't a perfect attack, but it was enough. The man staggered, giving Darius the half-second he needed. He grabbed the first shooter's head and drove it hard into the metal rail of the security checkpoint. The man went limp instantly. The second shooter recovered, twisting toward him. Darius dove. The suppressed shot hissed past his ear as he hit the ground, rolling, reaching. His fingers wrapped around the fallen gun. One shot. The second shooter crumpled. Silence. For the first time since stepping off that plane, Darius took a breath. People were shouting now. The airport staff was reacting, alarms blaring. Vivian was gone. Darius clenched his jaw. She had slipped away in the chaos, just like he knew she would. But he wasn't worried, because now he had proof, and he was going to bring her entire operation down. Darius stood in the middle of the chaos, the metallic scent of gunpowder still lingering in the air. Around him, airport security scrambled, passengers huddled in confusion, and the two downed shooters lay motionless. But Vivian Langley? She was gone. She hadn't waited to see the outcome. The moment the first shot was fired, she had done what professionals like her always did: disappear before the dust settled. Smart, but not smart enough. Darius turned, eyes scanning the crowd for Nina. She was gripping the edge of a luggage cart for balance, still unsteady but conscious. Her wide eyes met his. "We have to go," he said, moving toward her. Nina nodded weakly. "They're not done, are they?" "No," he said simply. "Not even close." He grabbed her arm, steadying her. The airport was now a mess of security and frantic staff trying to contain the situation. Police officers, real ones this time, were pushing through the crowd, shouting orders. Darius knew what was coming: questions, paperwork, and the inevitable attempt to sweep this under the rug. He couldn't let that happen. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yeah," she murmured. "Then we move now." They cut through the crowd, heading toward a side exit near the baggage claim. If he could get her out before the airport security locked everything down, they had a chance. But just as they reached the exit, a voice stopped him cold. "Darius Coleman." He turned. A man in a dark suit stood near the police perimeter. Clean-cut, middle-aged, the kind of presence that screamed government. Darius knew before the man even flashed the badge. FBI. "Agent Coleman," the man continued, stepping closer. "You're coming with us." The conference room was cold, sterile, and utterly devoid of personality, just like every other federal office Darius had ever been in. He sat across from two men in suits, both of them unreadable, their expressions carved from stone. They had brought him in fast, separating him from Nina the moment they reached the field office. He had argued, of course, told them she was a victim, that she needed protection, but they hadn't been interested in listening. Now he waited. The man in the middle, Special Agent Gregor, tapped a file against the table. "Quite the mess you left at JFK." Darius said nothing. "You want to explain why two men are dead and half the airport's security staff is writing reports about a first-class passenger engaging in hand-to-hand combat?" Darius leaned back in his chair. "Because I didn't feel like dying today." Gregor sighed. "That's not funny." "I wasn't joking." Silence stretched between them. Finally, the second agent, a woman in her late 40s, spoke. "You've been poking around in something bigger than you realize, Coleman." Darius's jaw tightened. "I know exactly what I'm poking around in, and I know who's at the center of it." Gregor nodded. "Vivian Langley." Darius wasn't surprised they knew her name. What surprised him was the way they said it, like it wasn't news to them. "She's not just some high-end criminal running an operation out of first-class cabins," Gregor continued. "She has connections. People in places you don't want to mess with." Darius's fingers curled into his palm. "That sounds like an excuse to do nothing." The woman tilted her head. "Number. It's a warning." Darius exhaled, forcing himself to stay calm. "And what about Nina Alvarez? What happens to her?" "She's in protective custody," Gregor said. "For now." Darius caught the hesitation in his tone. They weren't protecting her. They were silencing her. His stomach turned. "She's a witness." "She's a liability," the woman corrected. "If what you're saying is true, she knows too much, and that makes her a target." Darius sat forward. "Then let me talk to her." Gregor shook his head. "That's not happening." Darius's pulse pounded. He wasn't naive. He had seen this before. Cases that got too messy, too politically dangerous. The higher-ups would smother it, contain the damage, make it disappear, and Nina would disappear with it. Number not this time. Darius let out a slow breath. "All right," he said. "I get it." Gregor studied him. "Good." Darius leaned back, nodding. And as soon as they let him out of that room, he was going to burn their entire operation to the ground. Darius walked out of the interrogation room with a neutral expression, but inside his mind was racing. The Bureau wasn't going to help him. If anything, they were going to bury this case. Bury Nina. Bury everything. which meant he had to act now. As he passed down the sterile hallway of the FBI field office, he kept his posture relaxed, as if he had accepted their decision. He nodded at a few agents, received the usual professional indifference in return, and made his way toward the exit. They thought they had him contained. They had no idea what was coming. At the security desk near the front, an officer handed him back his phone and personal belongings. He took them with a nod, slipping his phone into his pocket while subtly pressing the power button 3 times. A silent distress signal. It wouldn't go to the bureau. It would go to the one person he knew he could trust. 10 minutes later, he was outside, the crisp New York air biting at his skin. The city was alive around him, but he wasn't focused on the honking cabs or the blur of passing pedestrians. His ride pulled up to the curb. A black SUV, windows tinted, engine purring. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing a familiar face. Malik Thompson, ex-cop, ex-FBI, and the only person Darius trusted when the system failed. Malik eyed him. Figured you'd need a ride. Darius opened the door and slid inside. We have a problem. Malik smirked as he pulled into traffic. Yeah, I figured that part out already. The warehouse smelled of oil and dust, the kind of place no one would think twice about. Perfect for what they needed. Nina sat at the metal table in the center, looking exhausted but awake. She flinched slightly as the door opened. But when she saw Darius, relief flickered across her face. You found me, she whispered. Wasn't easy, he said, pulling up a chair. The bureau wanted you gone. She swallowed hard. I know. Malik stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching for any signs of movement outside. He had pulled some strings, made sure Nina never made it to the so-called protective custody the bureau had promised. Darius leaned in. Tell me everything you know. Nina hesitated, then took a deep breath. Vivian isn't just running this. She's connected to people way above her. Judges, politicians, CEOs. They're all in on it. That's why they're covering for her. Darius had suspected as much. Nina's voice trembled slightly. They don't just use these flights to move people. They move information, deals, blackmail, everything. Darius exhaled. And the Bureau knows. Nina nodded. And they're choosing to look the other way. Malik scoffed. So what's the play? You go after them alone? Darius didn't answer right away. He looked at Nina. She had risked everything to break free. If he walked away now, she'd never be safe. Number. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Darius stood. We bring it down. Malik grinned. Now you're talking. Nina swallowed hard. How? Darius met her gaze. We start with Vivian. He turned toward the door, stepping out into the cold night. Somewhere out there, Vivian was running. She thought she had escaped, thought she had won. She was wrong, because Darius Coleman was coming for her, and this time, there would be no escape. As the night swallowed him, Darius knew one thing for certain. Justice wasn't always served by the system. Sometimes the system was the very thing protecting the corrupt. This wasn't just about Vivian Langley. It wasn't just about one flight, one operation. It was about the unseen hands pulling the strings, the powerful people who thrived in the shadows while others suffered. Darius had a choice: walk away and let the world keep turning as it always had, or fight, knowing the battle ahead would cost him everything. He had made his choice, and now the real war was beginning. What would you do if the system you trusted was protecting the guilty? How far would you go for the truth? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories of power, justice, and the fight against corruption, make sure to subscribe. There's always another story waiting to be told.